online. I was like, where are the familiar faces? But it's hard to tell sometimes with Zoom. So yeah, I'm going to present today on climate justice and the connections with colonialism, extractivism, and capitalism. This is an area I've worked in for a few years, but I kind of over time came to these understandings when I first started working on climate issues. I was working in Latin America and communications around climate justice, around why people in Bolivia are more affected and more vulnerable to climate impacts. And some of that was like geographic, because of being mostly a high altitude region, temperatures warm faster at higher altitudes. But then over time, and mostly from an political education from my Bolivian colleagues, I came to understand how the impacts of colonialism had caused that impoverishment and vulnerability that left people in a position where they're so much more affected by climate change. So from there I began to work on like accompaniment and solidarity with communities that are resisting or living with the impacts of fossil fuel extraction and mining across Latin America. And then when I moved back to Ireland in 2018, I've worked mostly as a climate justice educator, various different organisations, including most recently the City of Dublin ETB, which has been really focused on adult education and accessible education. So a little bit of what I'm trying to do here, because I'm aware, you're all teaching a very different context, you're teaching at secondary school, and materials do need to be made accessible. So what I'm going to present on today is for building your own understanding. Some of these issues are a lot to be bringing into a class kind of in this more lecture style way, but I have found personally that when I'm working on climate justice issues with groups where all of the internet connected issues, people are very aware, in fact, of the impacts of all of these interconnected issues. But myself, I found I had a lot more confidence as a facilitator and as an educator when I had a strong backing and strong understanding. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, maybe a little more. I have quite a few slides that I could share with you afterwards. Some resources I'll share at the end as well. We'll have a little bit of time for questions, and then we're going to do a practical hands-on, a practical activity of applying some of this in the classroom, and hopefully have time for a debrief afterwards. Okay, so without further ado, I will get going. So what we're going to cover is the history of the relationship between colonialism and extractivism in Latin America, and the emergence of capitalism, and how these dynamics continue to play out today in why some people are more affected by environmental and climate injustice, and how historical responsibility for carbon emissions relates to these issues. And then finally, I have a section on how movements for change and movements for climate justice are incorporating an understanding of these dynamics. Can everybody see? Am I in the way for you guys on this side? Can you see over there? Okay, good.
Well, if you want to swap Michael, that's grand.
That's
easier.
Yeah.
Right. So this isn't exhaustive. I will go through some things, like this is a lot. These are deep historical issues, real systemic dynamics. So some things I will not be able to go into in enough depth, but hopefully I'll be able to signpost, and we can talk about after where you might be able to find more information in parts that interest you. So the connections with learning outcomes in the course are to appreciate the links between climate change and global inequalities past and present, how these impact on climate action, to examine economic ideas contributing to global environmental limits being exceeded. Not so much the second part of that LO, but yeah, hopefully you'll have access to that with other facilitators. Explore how climate change impacts on people differently and the meaning of climate justice. And principally, explore how racism and colonialism have influenced demands for climate justice. Explore value systems in different societies, past or present, and their impact on how societies relate to nature. So this won't be, my focus on this will be more looking at the negative side of value systems, but there's others, of course, which are more positive. And then finally, and this is the activity that we'll do at the end together, is produce a visual root cause analysis of climate change, thinking critically about the values and systems that play a role in ongoing inaction. So yeah, the presentation will hopefully support you in achieving all of these learning outcomes. So the presentation is divided into 4 main parts. The first, just to cover kind of a base understanding of climate justice. So this definition is one that I worked on with colleagues in the City of Dublin ETB. That's in the handbook that's in the back of the room, and I have a hard copy as well I can leave back there. So climate justice is about knowing that the people who are hardest hit by climate change are the least responsible, and that we can only solve the problem by making the world fairer for everyone. You'll see a lot of definitions of climate justice that are a bit more high level. This was making it as accessible as possible. But what I'm trying to get at in this presentation is this bit about the people who are hardest hit by climate change. You'll often hear people from the global south. And then when you ask, why is that? Like, people will say, oh, it's because they're poorer. But what I'm trying to get to is, well, why are they poorer? How has this situation come about? And I think it's really important to do. So who is hardest hit by climate change? So this map is a vulnerability map. It's made up of calculating different social, economic, and environmental factors. And you can see, so dark blue are the most vulnerable regions, and the paler green are the regions that are less vulnerable. So this is people's vulnerability rather than just geographic vulnerability. So what this shows us, and what I'll show in the rest of the presentation, is how this vulnerability maps on to patterns of colonization. Like, you can look at the difference here between Europe and Latin America, or Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. So these vulnerabilities to climate change map onto patterns of flows of resources and wealth from the global south to the global north. And this is generally understood as part of climate justice, of course, that people in the global south are most affected, but delving into why, I think, is really key. You'll often see more geographic representations like this one, so where most people are affected by rising sea levels. This is purely geographic. It's not taking into account other social and economic factors. So you'll notice there that the US is kind of a bright red, so a lot of people in the US are going to be affected by rising sea levels, but also in India and China. But when we think about the resources that nations have to be able to deal with the effects of rising sea levels, for example, building sea walls, etc., you can imagine that the situation in the US is going to be a lot different to in India, for example. But maps like this don't really bring that forward. So just to be clear on the terms that I'm using, global south and global north. So really these they're not geographic terms, they're terms about, again, patterns of resource flows and wealth, and they really map on to colonial histories, even though of course there are exceptions in that. Like, Ireland is also a post-colonial, the Republic is also a post-colonial nation, but of course we have different patterns or different experiences of economics than in other post-colonial areas. But the terms global south and global north have to do with colonial histories. So just to wrap up this part of the presentation, what we're doing here as educators, trying to delve into climate justice in a more critical way, is to locate climate change, the climate breakdown and the climate crisis within its historical and political context. It's not just a scientific problem, it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it has to do with much, much more than that. So we're trying to understand the forces and mechanisms that created these issues and what maintains them. And an understanding of that can lead us to different perspectives, approaches, and potential actions that might emerge from this understanding. This quote is from, she used to be Vanessa Andreotti, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. You might have heard of her. She's a decolonial or anti-colonial educator, in kind of quite active in the GCE space. So, moving on to climate change and colonialism. So this quote is from a group in the US of women of color who are making a call out to the climate movement to include understandings of what they call the massive, messy tangle of colonialism, capitalism, racism, and patriarchy, which are at the root. They are the root causes of global warming, but are often left out of mainstream environmental movements. So this is challenging, of course, to include these understandings. It is not easy, but I think grassroots groups have had more success with this than those of us who are working in more institutional spaces because of the time it can take to kind of change these patterns of kind of root understandings, or for example, how history tends to be represented, and I'll cover that a little bit with colonization. But an example of grassroots movements kind of responding to this call would be Fridays for Future, which was quite global north oriented, but then really began to make an effort to put to the forefront their MAPA group, so their most affected people and areas group. So, okay, information slide incoming. So, after what's often called the discovery of Latin America, but is really the colonization of Latin America, which resulted in a genocide of indigenous peoples. This is when the concept of race was invented, and you can see here on the image of the slide produced by the Spaniards, a whole different series of categorizations of people based on their skin color. So in order to justify this genocide, enslavement, and brutal treatment of indigenous peoples, colonizers constructed an idea of inferior or superior humanity, or lack of humanity, built on religious beliefs and skin color. And they also, that dehumanization of indigenous peoples enabled the idea of a land without people, terra nullius. This was also used to justify the colonization of Australia later. So if the people living there are not considered human, then the land is there for the taking. So this only continued with the enslavement of African people for enslaved labor in the mines in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also in production of sugar and rubber and other forms of extraction. And all of this enabled an accumulation of wealth through this extraction and through this theft, really, of gold and silver and other resources, and of course of people's lives. So racialization is the term for ascribing characteristics to people based on race. And of course, this invention of race and the impacts of racialization still very much play out today with very violent consequences. And this racialization is one of the key roots of what we really mean when we say that people in the global south and people of color are more affected by climate change. And it is colonization that brought this about. So colonization, or this genocide, was often referred to as the Age of Exploration or the Great Exchange, but of course for people from those areas it is far from anything like what exchange or what exploration. It doesn't really make any sense. So our common understanding of this history is very different to that of people from these regions. So much wealth was extracted from Latin America, 150,000 tons of silver. And this image here is, it's Cerro Rico, the rich hill in Potosí, and I'll talk about that again in a minute, but it's known as the mountain that eats men. So many people died in this mine, but so much wealth was extracted from it by the Spaniards. It's in modern day Bolivia. So often this accumulation of wealth is left out of these stories of the narrative of colonization. An accumulation of wealth which then financed the creation of more colonies. Of course, Ireland, we can understand this being a test case for Britain's later colonization of India and other regions. And it helped to establish the trade dominance of Europe. So just to go back to Cerro Rico, that's an image there showing the kind of Spaniards exploiting the hill, and then this is a photo that I took in 2022. So it is still being exploited, although on a much lower scale. It's a bit of a hellscape, to be quite honest. And at time. So when the Spaniards were exploiting this hill, Potosí, the city, was known as the Paris of Latin America. Like there was a huge population there of settler colonizers, quite a lot of wealth, of course, hence that being known as the Paris of Latin America. But now Potosí is the most impoverished region in all of Bolivia, so these things are no coincidence. And there's a famous Latin American author, Eduardo Galeano, who wrote in one of his books, "You could build a silver bridge from Potosí to Madrid from what was mined here, and another bridge back with the bones of those that died taking it out." So these things are directly connected of this racialization of people, justification of brutal treatment and genocide, and then this extraction of wealth and mining, which continues today in different forms. So this is vastly summarized, and I apologize for going through this so quickly, but the accumulation of wealth from this colonial extraction and this brutal treatment of territory, of human life, and of more than human life, and the resulting trade and commerce from that set the scene for the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels, and the situation, the entwined crises in which we find ourselves today. So, to link that in to capitalism, so firstly I just want to cover some terms. So I kind of used colonization and colonialism in an intertwined way. Colonization is the physical act of settling and establishing control over the indigenous peoples of an area. Colonialism is the policy or practice of wealthy or powerful nations maintaining or extending control over other countries, especially in establishing settlements or exploiting resources. So yes, colonialism and colonization can be used in an intertwined way, but more in the process of actually settling in a place. Settler colonialism, as it were, but colonialism as a form of powerful nations maintaining control over resources is something that very much continues today, mostly in the form of corporate control, which I'll cover in a minute. So there's another concept, coloniality, which comes from Latin American scholars. So it's an invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after the end of direct colonization or colonialism. And another quote, "Coloniality of power works as a crucial structuring process within global imperial designs, sustaining the superiority of the global north and ensuring the perpetual subalternity of the global south using colonial matrices of power." And subalternity is another term it's a term for being ascribed a low ranking in a social, political, or other hierarchy. So it essentially means oppression or marginalization. So capitalism, without going into capitalism as an entire economic system, because that's not what this presentation is about, thinking of it as coloniality of power, of a way, as Jason Moore says here, a way of organizing nature. And there's another key scholar and key quote, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an amazing geographer and abolitionist from the US, whose definition of racial capitalism is that capitalism requires inequality to function and racism enshrines it. So this idea of capitalism as coloniality of power is the idea that capitalism is based on extraction of resources from those who are racialized and oppressed in different ways. And certainly we saw this was a dynamic underpinning colonization, and it continues today in a different form in our current economic system. So as we've seen, colonization played a role in the establishment of the Industrial Revolution. There's other dynamics at play. I went through it very, very fast, greatly summarized. And there were other dynamics such as the ongoing impacts of the enclosure of the commons, whereby people's access to land was removed and they're placed in a vulnerable position where working or migrating to the cities to work in factories. So this was also key to the emergence of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. But you'll often see, you'll hear like carbon dioxide levels are X% higher than they were in pre-industrial time. So it's always referring to this period of 1850, and you'll often also see this type of graph which shows how much temperatures have risen since 1850. What you won't see so much is an explanation of how that connects to capitalism. It's kind of like, oh, well, the Industrial Revolution just, it just happened. It was just an invention or a development, but it didn't have to go that way. So going back to our definition of coloniality, as an invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after the end of direct colonization or colonialism. So thinking about that term in terms of responsibility, historical responsibility for carbon emissions. So this graph shows overall carbon emissions. It's not a snapshot in time, it's accumulation over time. So you can see that North America and Europe are responsible for much more than half of overall carbon emissions. But Asia also looks quite high, but think of the population differences between these regions. So there's a huge difference in per capita emissions between North America and Europe have much, much lower populations in comparison to India or China. And to go back to our vulnerability map, so those who are most vulnerable really have the least responsibility for causing climate change. And that is at the core of climate justice definitions, but again, here in the presentation, we're kind of delving into a little bit more why that is. So just another mention that climate change, or responsibility for climate change very much maps onto class relations, which of course also have to do with colonial patterns. The world's wealthiest 1% account for more than twice the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. And then it very much maps onto corporate power. So while you'll often see, like the graph I just showed, kind of responsibility of nations, what you don't hear so much, except maybe more from kind of activist groups, is the responsibility of fossil fuel corporations. So 12.5% of all industrial carbon pollution has been produced by just 5 companies. Of course, these companies are all based in the global north. So this corporate power, this idea of coloniality as sustaining power relations of colonization very much is part of these dynamics of corporate power. So these corporations are able to operate transnationally. Some of them are, most of them are bigger than a lot of global south states. They're able to dodge taxes in countries, unfortunately, like Ireland. They're able to extract in impoverished regions and take advantage of those colonial dynamics where these countries don't have the ability to kind of enforce environmental regulations. And they're able to leave behind devastation for people and land in those regions. There's also a concept called atmospheric colonization, that they're treating the atmosphere as another site of colonization by polluting it with carbon emissions. So, and many of you will know already that the fossil fuel industry knew from the 60s that carbon emissions caused climate change, and they chose to cover it up, and they invested a lot of money in marketing and PR to fool the public into thinking, a bit like cigarettes are safe, fool the public into thinking that fossil fuels were not harmful at all. So the 20 companies that have extracted most fossil fuels since 1965 are responsible for 35% of all energy-related carbon dioxide and methane emissions worldwide. So relating this to extractivism, we saw a little bit of extractivism when we talked about colonization, like the mine in Potosí, which so much silver was extracted. So there's definitely, it's a bit hard to read there. So extractivism, the high-intensity, export-oriented extraction of common ecological goods rooted in colonialism and the notion that humans are separate from and superior to the rest of the living world. Or in a simpler form, it's the extraction of natural resources that get exported in a raw state and the country of origin gets little of the economic benefit. So that environmental and social costs, so the human costs, are externalized. So in other words, the polluter does not pay for any harm they've caused, as I mentioned, with these fossil fuel corporations. So essentially, these corporations are incentivized to externalize as many costs as possible in order that they can maximize their profits. So, as we know, this has been happening since colonial times. It happened in Ireland too, with massive deforestation by Britain. But after the Industrial Revolution, extractivism also kind of turned its focus to fossil fuels, and much of this taking place in the global south, but within Europe also taking place in working class and rural communities like the coal mines in the UK, and now in Ireland there's a move towards mining for minerals for the energy transition. A move towards across all of Europe, but focused on more peripheral regions of Europe, like Ireland. So just as climate impacts don't affect everybody equally, some regions become sacrifice zones for extractivism. So these patterns kind of map on to how people are racialized or otherwise marginalized and oppressed by colonial dynamics and by capitalism. So this extraction often takes place in marginalized, impoverished communities, so this can happen within countries as well, like the mining. The biggest mine that's planned for Ireland is in the Sperrins Mountains in County Tyrone, in a Catholic community. So these areas are sacrifice zones where it's seen as for the greater good to sacrifice clean air, water, and the people of that area, and more than human and nature, for the extraction of resources. So these patterns of exposure to climate change and to sites of extraction and the impacts of extractivism they're a map of coloniality, really. So these two graphs are showing, particularly along here in Chile and Peru, the amount of extraction of copper these are sites of mining conflicts where people have been criminalized for protesting against the mine, or there's been other forms of repression. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last part of the presentation. So movements for change. So thinking about what type of actions, climate actions, connect to all of these issues that I've been talking about. So one of them would be taking action on extractivism and corporate power. That connects, it connects all of these issues, and I'm going to talk about some of those groups now. But also, like you'll see in the protest sign, and it's a common slogan now, system change, not climate change. But that slogan is really getting at the dynamics that I've been talking about. So it's about shifting power, like calling for a change in those patterns of colonial power, calling for a change to the economic system. So under capitalism, power is consolidated in the hands of a few, same as during colonization. So looking for climate justice, which shifts power and changes the economic system. And you can see here as well, economic justice, reparations now, so reparations for colonization. And maybe this is a good moment to mention, I think I forgot another slide, is that in the climate negotiations, a lot of what gets labeled as climate finance for the global south to adapt to climate change is actually tied aid or loans, and countries are becoming more and more indebted. So you'll hear sometimes the term climate colonialism, and generally that's what it's referring to. It's referring to action on climate change that unfortunately is further entrenching these problematic power dynamics. So that's why this sign says reparations now. It needs to be freely given and untied aid. So there are many climate justice campaigns which seek to challenge these colonial power relations. A lot of it is in the global south, so people often place-based actions, and I know this course also has a lot of focus on place-based, and there's a real difference, I think, between people kind of becoming an activist on these issues that they care about, which is really important, but people who are seeking to protect their lives and their livelihoods from the impacts of colonial power and corporate power and extraction. So a lot of this does happen in the global south, but also in Ireland. You can see the celebration there of Ireland's ban on fracking. So there's also many climate justice groups in Ireland that in different ways take these dynamics into account. They all kind of have their different tactics and messaging. Some are more explicitly or radically kind of anti-capitalist than others. But I like to see it as a movement ecosystem, that different tactics and ways of working can be complementary. And then also to mention, I don't really have space to go into it here, but not all groups working on climate justice are obviously climate related. And maybe that came through strongly here at Bose, because you think, yeah, football community work, how does that relate to climate action? But it very much does. So actions for climate justice are really wide ranging. They address many different aspects of our lives. They're often rooted in community building, in working with communities that are marginalized in different ways, and solidarity with communities that are geographically far away from us, but share some of the same oppressions. Then I want to mention a network across all of the island of Ireland called Communities Against the Injustice of Mining. These are all community groups that are working to protect their land and livelihoods from various different mining projects. A good few of them are gold, which really has very little justification for extraction. Most of it is for jewelry. That which can be used or is used in medicine, for example, we have plenty of gold already. And then others are extraction for the transition to fossil fuels. So this is a tricky, or the transition away from fossil fuels rather. So this is a tricky one, of course, for, like, we want to see a transition away from fossil fuels, of course. So these groups will really be focusing on what's called degrowth, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. So a multi-level voluntary path towards the reduction of production and consumption aimed at aiming at ecological sustainability, good life, liberty, and social justice. So what these groups are saying, like, okay, yes, we do need renewable energy. Yeah, perhaps we're going to have to mine somewhat for that, but we don't want to see a transition from our current levels of production and consumption just straight over to this, maintaining those current levels and just transitioning to kind of a massive renewable energy, which will require quite a lot of mining. So to conclude, climate justice shows up in many ways of being and many ways of taking action. It's about transforming the way we understand the world. Yes, it can also be about making personal and community level changes to how we live, but rooted in an understanding of the importance of solidarity with those most affected by injustice. It's about changing the economic and political system, redressing power imbalances and unjust hierarchies, solidarity with people experiencing oppressions, and also transformative, empowering education. So the work that you're all doing is, of course, very much rooted in climate justice. So I'm going to cover briefly some resources that you might find helpful. The first two are about ways to kind of frame these issues, or ways to kind of inspire the value changes that we need to bring about a change to the economic system. So the first one is called Framing Climate Justice. It's a project by a coalition of organizations in Britain where they got people together and they framed climate change in various different ways and looked at how those messages landed with people. And I just picked out a few. So unpacking how climate change multiplies impressions rather than simply state that it does. So I tried to do a little bit of that, but it's possible to do that in a more accessible way as well, like in your classes, for example. So say, yes, people in the global south are more affected by climate change, but going into that in a little bit more detail, because it doesn't really, I think, make a whole lot of sense to people just as a statement unless they have other understandings. And using examples and metaphors to introduce the principle of system design. So these issues are really complex and they're hard to link together and get across. I hope I've done a good enough job of doing that with you today, but this group recommends using system design to help with that, and then connecting the dots between colonialism and climate change using system design. And they have a lot of other recommendations, so you might find that website useful. Another one is Beautiful Trouble. It's a toolbox. It's a collaborative collection of tactics, stories, methodologies, principles, and theories that have underpinned many different people-powered victories. They're not just specifically about climate change or climate justice, they're about many different areas of social justice and economic justice as well. Then I think you may have seen this already. So this is a handbook that I was involved in developing that tries to get at the issues I've talked about in a way that's more accessible. It is designed for adult learners at level 3 of the QQI framework. So it's designed to be as accessible as possible and really participatory. So that might be useful for you. I'm sure lots of you have already seen Financial Justice Ireland's resource, How the World Works. They have one section on climate change, but most of it is really relevant to climate justice because it's about understanding the injustices of the current economic system. And then finally, a resource from National Youth Council of Ireland, Climate Revolution. Some of these are there's one activity in there that's looking at climate misinformation, which might be useful, or climate denialism might be useful for some of you in whatever context you're coming from. And another activity which is a role play, which is helping to supporting students to understand how people are affected differently by climate change. Okay, so questions. Sorry, that was very fast.
You were saying something about companies paying taxes or like money that's going into like climate finance. Could you just explain what you mean again by that? You mentioned something that is like on loan. Like, are they loaning that to countries that don't have?
Yes. So in the last COP, in the last climate conference, for the first time there was discussion of creating a climate finance fund that would just be freely given. But up to now, the majority of what's labelled as climate finance are loans that are channeled through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And so they fit into the architecture that's already been established by those banks, which are a loan model. There was a lot of controversy around this new climate adaptation fund that is not a loan because it's going to be administered by the World Bank, or Global North nations wanted it to be administered by the World Bank, and Global South nations were said no because of the colonial architecture of those institutions. Yeah. Anybody else?
More comment rather than the question, just in terms of thank you so much. Just thinking about, I think you've made it really clear in terms of like climate justice and the organisations and kind of grassroots movements around that. I think a lot of what people tend to see is that kind of agency thing rather than accountability. So it's like, you do recycling, you get your usable water bottles, so it's kind of very sort of service thing, which I know, that whole sort of carbon footprint thing that was put up by PP. It's like the individual take responsibility for this rather than the companies or the governmental organisations, international organisations. I think it's really useful for me to just see that there is such a massive sort of movement in terms of actual climate justice and accountability rather than just sort of take personal agency, it's our job to sort it out. Well,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know, like in the context that I was working in the ETB, and I'm sure in your context as well, after learning about these issues, people want to take action, and often what's available to them is personal level change. So my approach with that has been encouraging that in a way that situates it in as like, okay, you'd like to do a recycling project. Let's look, why is there so much plastic? Where does it come from? Why plastic is made from fossil fuels, so there's corporate interests there. So, and then using that as like, maybe let's turn it into a communications project as well. So there's always ways, because I think it is important that people feel that they can do something, because if we just focus on personal level change isn't enough. For people who are at a certain stage of like understanding all of these issues, that can be really disempowering as well. So yeah, thank you for your comments. Anybody else?
Just a thank you. It was really interesting, and
Good.
I was fascinated by, I knew some of it, but what I didn't know, it's very helpful.
Good, thank you.
So just to say as well, perhaps an example of just really coming back to that agency and accountability thing and linking it into the colonialism extractive elements is just maybe using the Congo as like a massive case study.
Yeah.
From like Leopold down to the Colton, that's all of their video games and all of the
Absolutely.
players. I think just kind of relating it to the students and what they use and that's instrumental to their day-to-day living.
Yeah.
Through that.
That would be an excellent case study. Yeah, really, really good. Yes.
Thanks a million for that. I just learned more history from you and half an hour that I learned for several years in school. And where can we get your book, the handbook, and does it include obligatory references to your topics, colonialism?
So this one, there's a PDF which Nancy can share with you all, but it doesn't focus so much on specifically, like the activities are kind of a way in to discuss these issues.
Okay.
They don't necessarily present, because it's very much participatory and about kind of drawing out people's experiences. It's up to the role of the facilitator, I suppose, to be able to then kind of make those connections with things maybe people say in class and say, oh yes, well have you kind of thought about this, or why, or asking questions, asking why. So it isn't based, there's no activity in there that's going to say, this is about colonialism, this is about capitalism, because it's trying to kind of present it in a more gentle and accessible way. But I can recommend some other, for your building your own knowledge, I could recommend some readings of books and just send them around to you all afterwards. Happy to.
Just reflecting on ways to localize this information to where I live in my mind. And it's not the same thing, but I think there is shared belief system. So I'm thinking about in my rural town in Ireland, there was a bypass that needed to be built, a big road. Now geographically, it made sense for that bypass to go geographically in a certain area of town.
Right.
Now that received a lot of pushback from the people who lived in that area of town, because the people who lived in the area that made most sense for it were very wealthy, right? So now, anyone who drives to Longford has to drive around a whole other way to avoid that place where they had the power to push back. They were seen as fully human, they were seen as fully in their own agency to be able to decide. They had connections with people in power.
Yeah.
And it like a lot of people don't even know that that was on the table because it was swept under the table so very quickly. And now the position of that impacts people in the town with less power. And I also heard if you drive through any town in Ireland, you will always find the traveller halting site closest to the dump.
That's right.
And thinking about how do we bring this into this country? How do we bring it in and see it happening here? Is kind of what my mind's ticking over. I don't know if you have anything to say on how do you do that?
Well, perhaps building power in those communities that are being targeted as sites of extraction to be able to resist, which is challenging and difficult, precisely because people they might be just struggling with their livelihoods day to day. But like think of movements like the Community Action Tenants Union. It's a different issue, but that's building power around corporate landlords. And the Community Action Tenants Union, CATUs. So building power of tenants to be able to defend themselves against corporate landlords or against evictions. It's one example. Or other groups, like all of the groups that have sprung up around organising community groups, organising against the far right. There are different examples, but my take on it would be getting the community that's being targeted for the road, getting that community organised is the way, because I don't think that the people who are in the positions of power are not necessarily going to be that interested in learning about these dynamics. But yeah, relating it to extractivism, I think a number of years ago there was oil, potential for oil drilling off the coast of Dalkey, and of course that did not, there's no way that went ahead, but Shell's gas refinery off the coast of Mayo, full steam ahead, no problem. And this is also happening with the projects for mining across Ireland. Like you'll see, there's geological reasons, but they're really mapped across the northwest and north of Ireland where communities are most marginalised. So that's really interesting about the
I'm
lots
just
of road.
wondering how, like, in a classroom that would have members from different communities in it.
Yeah.
Any tips on, like, and maybe this is to the group as well, avoiding ussing and demming, avoiding absolving or blaming.
I suppose I try to treat it as more of a dealing with these on a theoretical level, and I try not to make it very personal. Other people, that's me, because I'm more comfortable in that kind of role, and I think I've seen other people who have really great facilitation skills be able to deal with, because people do kind of react sometimes. And I did have actually one person in my class, in adult education class, community, in climate justice, who reacted to a quote, it's a quote that's in the handbook about climate justice, and climate justice, or like access to climate adaptation is not just for white people, it should be for everybody. And people are like, well, why is this mentioning white people? What does that have to do with it? And I just kind of ask questions. That tends to be my like, oh, why do you think that? And draw them out a little bit more. And sometimes, if necessary, kind of counter that. But often I found that other people in the class will kind of take care of that as well. Other people will have something to say around who have people who have different experiences. So sometimes the class themselves will kind of deal with those differences. And it can be really, for people who come from really different backgrounds, it can be really eye-opening. Okay, anybody else? Anybody this side of the room?